What's up guys, Asian here again with another video, and this one's going to be a little bit more on the informative side. So there was a new interview that came out on Alexos's YouTube channel. I will have links in the description below to those two videos. So Alexos is I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe he is a Twitch stream team member for ESO, and he is a German player as well. So the videos themselves, I believe, all the questions that he asks are in German. Rich Lambert does not speak German as far as I'm aware, so he answers in English. What happened was we're going to be going over the translated questions that are posted on the official forums here. There will also be a link to the description below to that thread if you guys want to read that entire thread in its entirety. But let's go ahead and get started. So for Rich Lambert, for those of you guys who don't know about the general leadership structure here, Brian Wheeler is the lead combat developer. Rich Lambert, I believe, is the lead creative developer. So they both work closely together, but Rich Lambert does not necessarily have a ton of say in combat. So I did talk with them at PAX East, and Lambert and Wheeler, while they do work together, they both operate under circles that have some slight overlap, but not entire overlap. So Rich Lambert also covers other gameplay things as well, not just the combat. Here is the English translated questions with the answers here. Just going down the list here. The first question is, will Serana show up in Greymore? I'll let people play and see how we're giving a nod to TES5, not in a way players will expect. So if you guys remember from Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, Serana came with the Dawnguard DLC, and she is one of the original vampires that Molag Bal created. So she should be active as of the second era because Molag Bal created the first vampires around the first era. So obviously the question was, will we see this character that was much beloved in Elder Scrolls V return in Greymore? Rich basically said they are going to be giving some, nods to Elder Scrolls V, but because of the different time periods, he can't say for certain. I've already kind of mentioned this when we talked about Greymore preview when it first came out, but Greymore and Elder Scrolls V are in two very different timelines. They're hundreds of years apart, so don't necessarily expect things to be the same between Skyrim and Greymore. Are all boss fights in the new trial on Kyne's Aegis? Rich says all the encounters are very different. One takes place on a longship, gets more spectacular as you progress. So Kyne's Aegis is, I believe, an island, I want to say. So he's basically saying that no, not all the fights will occur on this sort of beach island kind of thing. Question number 3, does the Antiquity system have group content or is it exclusively solo? The vast majority is geared around solo play, but they can be found in normal difficulty dungeons as well. So you don't need to group up for dungeons or trials to get to make the most out of the Antiquity system, but they did say that you can find them in normal dungeons. So I'd imagine you'd also be able to do it on Vet as well, and it'd still be there, but it might just be limited to normal, who knows. Will we see living Dwemer in ESO? That's a very touchy subject. Anything is possible, but we're not doing that right now. Dwemer play a large role in Blackreach, but no physical Dwemer there. So the Dwemer at this point in time should have disappeared. So this was way back in the first era, towards the end of the first era, when the Dwemer actually disappeared. So it seems unlikely that we're going to see any living Dwemer unless we do a very back in time. This would be the pre-Dunmer. So the Dunmer were originally the Chimer. So this would be something like the Chimer era of the Elder Scrolls universe, which we haven't really touched upon. It's all through lore books and things like that. Number 5, any plans to add gear setups like dressing room add-ons to the game? They know it's a request. What I'll say right now is that they're looking into it, so no promises, but especially for console players, this is more on the developer side, so Sony and Microsoft than ZOS's side. Would a loot cap for 12 players be lifted from Delve and World bosses like it was for Elsewhere Dragons? No, there's technical reason for that, and designed to avoid exploiting player behavior. There might be a balance point above 12 players, so they might look into increasing it, but the cap has a reason. Will there be werewolf changes? A few. You already know about that. Will we get more housing items like walls, grasses, etc.? We know people want to do more of that kind of stuff, and we have to keep the furnishing limit in mind. So there is still that furnishing limit. It doesn't seem like it's going up, but I believe Nevis did say that there are plans to update housing, so maybe it includes upping the furnishing limit. We don't know. Any ETA for the CP system revamp? This is a big question here. Rich says internally yes, externally no. CP affects everything, and we want to make sure to look into everything. Other combat changes like light attack changes would have to come beforehand. I want to do a combat roadmap like the performance roadmap, but don't know when yet. So if you guys remember, they did freeze CP cap increases, so every single DLC in the past used to increase the CP cap by 30 points, or in other words, 10 points for each of the 3 different lines. But they eventually decided to freeze it at 810 because they were concerned about power creep and the effect that CP was having on the game. Now, Code did a post on this way back when this was first introduced to demonstrate that CP does not contribute significantly to power creep, but that system is still in place, so CP is still frozen, and they did say they were going to do something that would completely replace the CP system, but from the answer that Rich is providing, it does seem like that's quite a ways off. Are you still working on Battlegrounds? Rich says, still looking on the queue. There are still weird edge cases. Player feedback is evenly split on solo versus group queues. Lots of work to do. For those of you guys who are complaining about solo queues, they are looking into possibly adding in group queues again, but it sounds like it's still a work in progress. Next question, why can't we see our MMR, our matchmaking points? We don't want players to bully each other because of their score. Same reason for absence of gear scores in PvE. So that's why you can't see your MMR, because they don't want us to be dicks to each other. The second video, more questions. Guild system improvements. They're taking a look at guilds in general, not ready to talk about things. They're looking into managing tools, progression type systems, and so on. So they are looking at improving the guild infrastructure. We'll be able to put our characters into our homes. Teams are looking into things like that, how to put more life into player homes. This might tie into Nef's comment about there might be some big updates for housing in the near future. What was the biggest challenge in Greymoor's development? Biggest technical challenge was the antiquity system, the new UIs and the minigames. For story and world building, it was telling their own story at a familiar place, thus focus on Blackreach and new spaces there. For 15, will there be mythic items with specific abilities that increase damage on specific enemy types? So things like Wolfbane, for example, deals more damage against wolf-type enemies. That one specifically, no. They already have an inventory problem, and not all encounters are created equal. Some enemy types are rarer than others. Buffs should have a general appeal. That kind of ties into probably their general set design, maybe. That's anything that's buff should have a general appeal rather than a specific niche sort of scenario. Any more information on the new trial? The example they gave was the second boss is on the giant longship. You create ballistae out of pieces of the longship. That actually sounds pretty interesting. Kind of reminds me of, if you guys have played this, Barbarian Assault in RuneScape, where you have to fight the boss, but it's not a traditional beat boss until it's dead. You have to cooperatively play with each other to create basically a nuke egg to nuke the boss. So I'm actually interested in seeing if they're going to be able to do something like that with this. Players should have fun messing with that. For the third boss, so there are 3 bosses, so this is going to be the last boss, probably. Essentially 3 different fights for each phase. Players should see the team has learned a lot, and when they say the team, they refer to the Trials and Dungeons combat team. So this actually makes it sound like this trial might actually be interesting. Like I said, that create ballista out of pieces of the longship sounds very reminiscent of Barbarian Assault from RuneScape, and I had a lot of fun playing that minigame there. But it'll be interesting to see how exactly it's going to play out. Whether you have somebody dedicated to create, let's say, like the ballista base, and then you have to create the ballista strings. It'll be interesting to see how it works out, whether it's just a simple interact with this piece at this time and protect this player from taking damage, otherwise they lose the piece. There's a lot of different ways I can see this playing out, so I'm actually kind of excited to see that part. For the 3 different fights for each phase, I really wanted to see sort of multi-phase fights in ESO, and while we do have something like that, for example, you can argue like things like Pinnacle Factotum, you split into 2 phases, like you have the ground phase, then you have the upstairs phase with the spheres. It's not really what you would consider like a multi-phase fight you would see in other games where, the boss transforms, has a completely different move set or something like that. So I'm actually interested in seeing just how different these phases are for that third boss when they come into play, whether it's evenly split or it's going to be something like at 50% health, he goes into the second phase, and at 25% health, he goes into the next phase, and so on. So hopefully, it's something similar to Symphony of Blades fight from the Depths of Maltar, where after you kill the first phase, you go into a second phase. But hopefully, at the same time, not like that, because that second phase is basically we're going to put in all the moves on the last phase, which, well, yeah, it makes the fights more difficult. It doesn't really make it more interesting because you already saw the moves. So hopefully, they introduce completely new move sets, new mechanics in those different fight phases. Any plans to add new difficulty settings for dungeons for vet players? Dungeons might be easy, but there's a huge skill gap in the game. That's why there are opt-in hard modes. Veteran is generally easier than older dungeons. Team is looking at completion rates all the time and adjusting based on that. When I talked with Lambert and Wheeler when I talked with Lambert mostly at PAX East, I did mention, how they were going to address this sort of skill gap, and they did say that's why they have these opt-in hard modes, and that's why they introduced hard mode for each of the different dragons in Sun Spire. That way, players are able to kind of create their own difficulty, essentially creating different tiers of difficulties. So you have normal vet, you have vet with one hard mode, vet with two hard modes, all hard modes, etc. So that does seem like the route that they want to take in the game, sort of build your own difficulty, so to speak. That being said, dungeons are obviously much more different than trials. You can't exactly do opt-in hard modes for each dungeon boss, but who knows, they might try that in the next dungeon DLC, but it is good to see that they're taking a look at completion rates. Of course, the question is, how are they computing those completion rates? There are teams that go for Trinity achievements, for example, or no death achievements that reset after a death. Does that count towards the completion rate? And so on. So it's nice to see that at the very least they are paying attention to the difficulty settings for dungeons, which are kind of this sort of middle ground between casual players and endgame players. Will things like Godslayer achievements be adjusted with light and heavy attack changes? They were really looking for feedback during the off-cycle PTS. They said we either loved it or we hated the changes. There's not much in between. They want to do these types of tests more often in the future. So this doesn't really answer the question, but my gut feeling is they would be adjusting it based on the changes, based on the feedback that they get during these off-cycle PTS. Emphasizing again, it is very important to give that feedback whenever there's a PTS cycle, off or on cycle. Any plans for new assistants that aren't just reskins? They have to walk a fine line with this because they still want people to go back into the towns. Any overhauls for gear traits are on a list of things to look at. Divines and Sturdy are currently overrepresented. Weapon traits are in a better state. Not sure when they'll get to it. So be on the lookout for gear trait rework in the near future. Divines and Sturdy, so for both DPS and tanks. Healers as well. You guys also use Divines as well. And it is true. Pretty much you are always going to be using Divines on DPS. Tanks have a little bit more leeway here. Sturdy or Infused are both relatively good options. They're pretty even, but Sturdy is one of the best options for tanks. So I can understand they want to overhaul gear traits, but at the same time, as somebody who does theory crafting, who does endgame PvE content, and I'm sure this is the same for PvP as well, people are just going to gravitate towards the best option anyways. So my personal opinion is just leave the gear traits as is. By adjusting them, the only thing you're doing is just getting people to farm new gear, to transmute for the new best trait. So you're not really changing anything, you're just sort of, moving the goalposts, so to speak. What's the official stance on gold/crown trading? The gifting system opened this sort of gray market. He doesn't love it, but they don't control it, and it causes a lot of community support tickets. They're not stopping it right now, but it's not ideal. They want to make it a real system in the future, and they're just watching it for right now. So this crown/gold trading is basically, if I pay you 500,000 in-game gold, I will be able to purchase X amount of crowns. So that's what they mean by crown/gold trading. This is a form, technically speaking, of real-world trading, because you can buy crowns. It's real-world money, so you basically buy crowns, you sell them for in-game gold, so you're essentially buying in-game gold with real-world money. So it is sort of real-world trading, which is obviously, generally speaking, frowned upon in the MMO community. Now, there there have been old systems in place that were introduced in other MMOs. Going back to the RuneScape example, they introduced bonds, which you can buy from with actual money that goes towards Jagex, and the bonds could be sold to other players, and they can be redeemed for various things like memberships and things like that. This is sort of already what is in place right now. Basically, you buy crowns, which goes directly back to ZOS. Then you can use those crowns to sell crown items to players for in-game gold. So technically, it already sort of falls into bonds. You can think of the Crown Store in general as this sort of RuneScape bond equivalent. But it does seem like they're kind of in this, like, we don't really like it, we don't really want this, but we'll have to see exactly how they go ahead with that. Right now, they're still tolerating it, but it's clear that they don't necessarily want this in place. Final question, any more plans for more quest content that requires group play like the old Craglorn? They won't say it'll never happen, but questing works best for solo play. So Craglorn, the zone, was introduced, I believe, in the first year, so it was the first major update for ESO, and the idea behind Craglorn was this was a sort of veteran zone where you would need a group of people to complete the delves and stuff. So if you go onto Craglorn and look at your map, it actually says group delves. That was sort of the niche that Craglorn fit in when it was first introduced. Obviously, with power creep, with the introduction of CP and one Tamriel Unlimited, that all sort of fell by the wayside. Now you can pretty much solo a lot of the content in Craglorn, including the boss fights. So it sort of was a veteran sort of overland content, but it clearly seems here that Lambert prefers that it remains sort of a solo world, so to speak, outside of Craglorn, because that is, historic. They can't really just go back and rework Craglorn. But that was it. 22 questions in all. Some good pieces of information here, kind of looking into behind the scenes what's going on here. A little bit of hints towards combat reworks, hints towards new trial mechanics. So overall, pretty interesting interview here. Again, I'll have links in the description below to those two videos, as well as the forum post here with the translated questions. I hope you guys enjoyed. That is it for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.